Good evening, at least on the East Coast, it's evening. Welcome to the 2024 Latinx Kidlit Book Festival. I'm Cindy L. Rodriguez, and I will be moderating this panel. First thing I'd like to do is just to alert everyone to please read our anti-harassment policy in the chat box. And don't forget to subscribe to the Latinx Kidlit Book Festival's YouTube channel. If you are a school, classroom, librarian, or educator joining us, our school visit fund is back. You can enter to win a free visit from a Latinx author or illustrator for your classroom or library. You can find the link to the entry form in the chat as well. So again, welcome to this panel. The first thing I'd like to do is to just have everyone, each of the authors, introduce themselves and their most latest book. So why don't we start with Ashley?
Hi, everyone. My name is Jean Granillo, and I am the author of Cruzita and the Mariacheros, about a young girl who has to learn how to speak Spanish so that she can join a mariachi band and save her family's bakery. No big deal, right?
Great, thanks. All right, Juan, how about you?
Hello, everyone. My name is Juan Vidal, and I am the author of the novel A Second Chance on Earth, about a 16-year-old boy named Marcos who loses his father and grows closer to his father by finding his late father's copy of 100 Years of Solitude, the novel by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and he grows closer to his father through his father's love for that novel.
Great. And Racquel?
Hi, I'm Racquel Marie. I'm going to be talking about my book, This Is Me Trying, which is about estranged childhood best friends, Beatriz and Santiago, who have not seen each other in about 2 years since the funeral of their mutual best friend, and then spend their senior year reconnecting over their grief and their kind of journeys with their mental health.
Great. So our panel is titled Wish You Were Here. And obviously it's all of our books. My book, Lola Reyes, So Not Worried, also deals with grief. But I'd like for each of you to take a little time to talk about the person who's missing, right? It says, wish you were here. Who is that person that your main character wishes was still around? And if you could talk a little bit about the effect that losing that person has had on your main character. This time, why don't we start with Juan?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, my main character's name is Marcos, and he's 16. And when he loses his father in this tragic accident, it sort of piques his interest to learn more about his father, who's definitely his hero, who he has on this pedestal. He's always been there for him. He's always promised to show him all of these things as he gets older. And obviously he starts that process, but through the tragedy that ends. And so when he finds the novel by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, it draws him closer to his father in ways that he never would imagine, because his father, even though he was very masculine and he was a man's man and he was a protector, he also had a love of poetry and a love of language. And so through that example that his father has always set, Marcos starts to gravitate to those things even more so, because he starts to find meaning and have all these different memories that for him were at one point out of context, where he didn't know what some of these comparisons and what some of these parallels were. What is the picture of this old man on my father's bookshelf, which was Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And through this tragedy, he grows closer to his father. He learns more about Colombia and Cartagena specifically, where his father is going to be buried. His ashes are going to be spread, which is also where Gabriel Garcia Marquez's ashes were spread. And so through this whole process, he really gains a new appreciation for this hero that he lost prematurely. So he has to find meaning in those things. And that grief, is able to, turn into hope in time.
Great. And hold on to that, because we'll talk about the sort of upside of once you're kind of getting out of grief in a minute. So I want you to go into that a little more deeply. Ashley, why don't you tell us a little bit about who is missing from your MC's life and how that's affected her?
So Cruzita had a gran tío Chuy, so great grand uncle, who was basically her one connection to her culture. So her Mexican American heritage, and they would spend mornings singing. Well, he would sing in Spanish and she would listen, and then they would take turns sharing music with one another in the van before going to school, the bakery van. But unfortunately, he passes away, and with that, a lot of that connection is gone, because unfortunately, the rest of Cruzita's family doesn't really hone her in her Mexican heritage as much as he did. And not only does it affect her, but it affects her entire family. Her family loses essentially, all of his recipes, because he is the heart and soul of the bakery. So they lose his recipes and they scramble to try to figure out how he made certain things. So even his sister, Mama Vicenta, who, is wonderful at making tortillas, she's not really good at making like baked goods. And so she also spends some of her time learning how to create creations of her own that are kind of reminiscent of Tío Chuy's work too. So together, Cruzita and her family are all trying to learn parts of each other, of their past and of their heritage at the same time.
Great, thank you. And Racquel.
My book has two main characters, Beatriz and Santiago, and they were both childhood best friends with another boy named Bryce. And in the past of the book, prior to the book starting, their friend Bryce died by suicide. And so this book takes place about 2.5 years after his funeral, and they haven't seen each other since then. Beatriz has remained in the small town in Vermont that they all grew up in. She has sort of been entrenched in the grief the whole time, been very isolated from everyone. And Santiago had moved away shortly before Bryce's passing, and he is now moving back. So he has been very separate from all of it, very removed from the situation, and is now returning to this hometown that is sort of unrecognizable to him now that he has lost somebody. So it was interesting for me to get to write about these two characters dealing with the same loss, but dealing with it in very different ways. They had different connections to Bryce. Santiago had this really close friendship with him, but fought with him a few months before he passed away. So he's dealing with a particular level of guilt with that grief over the fact that they did not end on good terms. And Beatriz was dating Bryce when he died. So she feels another degree of guilt as well, that she felt responsible, or like she should have been able to save him or help him in a way that a child at the time would not have really had the ability to do for another child. So there's a lot of heartbreak mixed in with that, but there's also a lot of bonding then, because the two of them have spent the past 2.5 years kind of feeling like they're the only person in the world that understands this particular loss. And now they are reunited. And while there's a lot of anger and frustration between them, they also are able to unite over the fact that they understand each other in a way that few people would be able to. And there's other grief sort of woven into the background with Beatriz. Her father died before she was even born. So she's always spent her life kind of yearning for some type of connection with him, and has sort of been grieving since she existed. And Santiago was raised by his abuelo, who he's now moved back in with, and he worries a lot about his abuelo getting older and this sort of preemptive grief and knowing now what it's like to lose somebody and fearing that before it's even going to happen. So grief is sort of the backbone of the story, but I know we're going to talk about some of the brighter parts of when you have lost someone. So that's kind of the general focus of how it's woven between these characters.
Great. Just moving on to that particular part, our panel discussion, the description promises like the ups and downs of grief. And I think that most people who, have lost someone, and even if they haven't, if you read books about people who have lost someone, there tends to be like the downside seems obvious, right? Like there's sadness, there's heartbreak, there's frustration, there's guilt, there's all sorts of those things. So obviously I want you to talk about that specifically to your book. Like, was there one particular emotion that perhaps your character, on the spectrum of the grief spectrum that we, people have talked about, was there one emotion in particular that your character was really struggling with on that downside? But then also, I'm really interested in having you talk about that sort of, what is the upside? What do they learn, or what uplifting thing comes out of the grief, after, like, what are they able to sort of discover or enjoy once they're past the hurt? So this time, why don't we start with Ashley?
So Cruzita, definitely, I would say, like, the downsides for her is there is a lot of anger and frustration, specifically because without Theo Chui, she kind of loses the connection even with, like, her mom. And so even her parents seem to be at a distance from her, and she has a really hard time communicating specifically with them, and again, specifically with her mother. So her relationship with her mom is strained because her mom is also taking on this really big, endeavor to, make the bakery last. Because if the bakery lasts, Theo Chui is gone for, if it ends, Theo Chui is gone forever, right? The bakery dies, Theo Chui is gone forever. So everyone is trying to hold on to this. So their angers and frustrations are all being thrown at each other, as well as Concha's at the same time. So the family is having food fights, and there's fighting, words are exchanged. Cruzita's not having a great time in school. She's failing Spanish. And so for her, she just seems like she's just totally lost. She doesn't know what to do. So she will often go to, at their house in Pacoima, California, there is this orange citrus grove where Cruzita will go to try to find her Theo Chui, like find his soul, his ghost. And so she lingers in there sometimes and has like these somber moments. But similarly, in that grove is where she starts building connections with her Mama Vicenta, so her grandma, and she also starts building friendships there as well. So it's not all bad, right? It's kind of like throughout the novel, you see her go through all of those stages of grief. There is that moment of there's anger, like, why is he not here? Why am I still stuck in this position where I can't learn anything? Why does nobody want to teach me anything? He was my connection. And then slowly over time, the more she branches out, she starts finding a little part of herself and a little bit of Theo Chui in her community that she hadn't seen before. So without his passing, it's almost like, in some ways, I don't want to say it's a blessing necessarily, but without him being gone, she won't be able to move in the trajectory of finding herself. So there are some lighthearted moments in that aspect where, now she doesn't know how to speak Spanish, and he was teaching her, and she fails Spanish, right, at school. But her Mama Vicenta sees that Cruzita wants to be a musician. So there's this plan, let's put her in mariachi school to help her get that connection back. So definitely, and we'll talk more about that later, but definitely those are like the lighthearted moments of like, I can go find myself now. And when I find myself, I will also still find Theo Chui at the same time because he's in me. So yeah.
Great, thank you. Racquel, can you pick up there?
Yeah, I was sort of saying with the first question that the kind of downside, or the heaviest downside for these two characters and their loss, is that they feel a great degree of guilt from their particular positions. And I think it's especially strong in that they have lost someone who is the same age as them. And so every sort of year that they continue to grow and get older feels like a betrayal. Every kind of milestone that they pass, they know that they are doing it without someone that they always imagined being alongside them. So there's an additional level of guilt in the loss itself, but also in every day that they move forward. They feel like he is this absence that they can feel every day in their lives. But for the characters, each specifically with kind of a brighter side that they are able to find in this, there's a bittersweetness for the character Beatriz, because she also struggled with depression and sort of her mental health throughout her life, and seeing the impact that someone dying so young had on all the people around her, and seeing the real permanence of death and understanding what it truly means to be gone, she is able to have, to some degree, a greater appreciation for life and this hopefulness as well, because she sees that things can get better, even when it feels like you're at the absolute worst that you're ever going to reach. You're still able to wake up the next day and find some reasons to continue onward. And it's unfortunate that this comes on the tail end of losing somebody, but it gives her the perspective of knowing how much it hurts people when someone who feels like no one would miss me if I'm gone is gone. She feels the direct impact of that. And so when she is feeling particularly down, when she is struggling immensely, she recognizes now from the other side of things how much people do care and how many people would miss her if she was gone. And for Santiago, he has sort of struggled for the past several years, feeling super isolated and sort of pretending as if none of this has ever happened at all. And now that he is back, he's forced to confront all of these emotions, but he's also forced to confront the fact that his friend, who he has spent the past several years feeling really guilty over being in a fight with, did still love him, that there were still good memories between them, that there were still kindness and appreciation between them. And he sort of gets to reclaim or regain that memory and that connection by being close with his family, by talking through these memories with other people, by actually reconnecting with the people who can share this loss with him. So it's his sort of upside is about embracing the grief and embracing the loss and embracing the people around him instead of isolating himself. And both of the characters really have to come to terms with the fact that they are not the only people that experience this loss, that the other person has experienced it, but also it has had this ripple effect on their friends, family members, the community around them, their own parents and their own families. And sort of being able to recognize that grief is it's a very particular and unique experience for each of us, but it's also unites all of us together. There's a quote in the book that one of my friends actually said to me when we were talking about grief that is like, grief is all the same, but it's all different. And I think that kind of gets at the root of what each of these characters gain through the process of losing somebody so young, is that they're able to recognize that their pain is both unique to themselves, but also something that can unite them with other people and they can connect and bond over.
Great, thank you. And Juan, let's hear from you about the ups and downs.
Yeah, that was also beautifully said, and I find so many parallels between all of these books, which is really fun to think about. But in my case, in the case of Marcos, after his father passes, and Marcos, along with his mother and sister, are going to travel to Cartagena to spread his father's ashes. In that process, the family is befriended by a young taxi driver who is only a year or two older than Marcos, and so. After a lot of convincing, Marcos's mother allows Marcos to sort of explore the city with this taxi driver named Camilo. And Camilo introduces him to the city, which was a place that Garcia Marquez, the author, held very dear, because it was where he started his own writing career and was later buried because it had such a significance to him. And so through all of these things, while Marcos is wrestling with this grief, he's starting to strike up a friendship with this person who he can actually relate to, who's teaching him all of these things. And it's particularly what Ashley mentioned about this idea of chasing a ghost. It's a very similar thing for Marcos. He's chasing the ghost of his father. And then what Racquel mentioned about these ripple effects, right? Because Marcos is dealing with loss, but so is his sister, so is his mother. And so everybody's experiencing grief in different ways, but therein lies the beauty of art, right? Where we all, if we've lost somebody, whether through death or just through the end of a relationship, sometimes we look for different things to fill the void of that loss. And in this particular novel, it's another novel. So this is the book about a book. Mine is like a commercial for 100 Years of Solitude, just to get you to read that book. But it's really interesting because there's so much magic in that book, and there's so much beauty and strangeness that when he's picks it up and he's gravitating to this poetry, he sees his father in all of these characters. He sees his father in the grandmothers and the neighbors and the flying carpets and crocodile children. All these weird things have all of these parallels to his own father, or at least he finds them, maybe where they don't exist, but to him, it's so personal. And so to answer, I guess, the question in a long way is it's the beauty of art to find us at the right moments in our lives. It could be a movie, it could be a book, It could be a photograph, that sort of help to fill that void and bridge the gap between grief and then hopefully hope and meaning.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to throw a curveball at you because I know I sent you questions, but now that you're talking, I've got like a new question that's forming. And it's kind of about the like you were talking about ripple effects. And it just got me thinking that obviously when a character is dealing with loss, is dealing with grief, like that's not the only thing that's happening in their lives either, right? So you talk about Marcos has a sister, or Beatriz has her mom and other friends and other things that she's in school. It's her senior year, right? She's a senior and has to decide what to do with herself. And Cruzita has her family, and the whole bakery issue is connected to, but also separate from like what she's experiencing internally. So obviously grief is central to everybody's story, but I guess that then lends the question of like, we including this loss and dealing with this loss, everybody has all these other things happening in their life. So I guess, how does that then factor into your story? Like, is the grief like, the main filter that your character is looking at everything in life in this moment because it's just so profound? Or is being in school a good escape, at least for 5 hours, 6 hours a day? Or maybe thinking about the bakery, even as much as it angers her, is something to get her mind off of her immediate hurt. Like, can you talk a little bit about like the other threads in your story that your character has to deal with, and is or isn't it related to the grief, or does the grief factor into any of those things at all? Racquel, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent curveball question. I think that, for my characters, they're struggling with sort of a couple different things in the background. For Beatriz, she is an excellent student, and largely in some way because she's kind of done nothing else with her day. She's isolated herself completely. And so she's like top of her class. She gets into every college she applies to, but she doesn't really want to pursue traditional education. She's very interested in makeup, which, I'll touch on later. But she wants to go this kind of unconventional route. But her mom had her when she was a teenager, and her dad died before he could even go to college. And so she feels this additional measure of guilt, not only linked with all of her grief, but also in that she is trying to turn down a future that neither of her parents were able to have because her father died and her mom had to start taking care of a child when she was so young. And so she is struggling with kind of reclaiming what she wants out of her life and what she wants for her future, that it's been so hard for her to look at the horizon because it means an entire life without these people that she loved and wanted to know and wanted to grow older with, but also because it means actually saying firmly and definitively, this is what I want to do. And maybe not everyone's going to agree with it, and maybe it's not what other people have planned, but I want to live my life and I want to pursue these things. So throughout the book, she is really struggling with that, with measuring her expectations. She's close with her mother and she loves her mother, but her mom really wants everything for her, and she just kind of wants a very simple path that is more aligned with her interests. And for Santiago, he has spent the past several years really separate from this loss and pretending kind of like it didn't happen. And so he has abandoned friendships from where he moved away. They all grew up in a small town in Vermont. He moved away to California for several years, and now he's back. And the people that were in Vermont are kind of trying to reach out to him, or people that were in California are trying to reach out to him and wondering, like, where have you gone? We understand this loss now. Like, he keeps cutting off these pathways because he doesn't want to deal with all the emotion that comes from it. And so he's struggling to reconcile with the fact that he has been responsible for hurting other people, even if it was a consequence of his own pain, and recognizing some of that behavior in the way that his father has been really absent from his life and prioritizing his dreams over raising his son. So both of the characters have these independent journeys kind of about what they want versus what other people want, and finding a way to balance that in a way that accommodates everyone and is kind and courteous, but also doesn't end up prioritizing one vastly over the other at the expense of either their own happiness or the people around them. That's all of that is both separate from the grief in some way, but it's also very heightened and influenced by the grief, because I think all of our characters can probably relate to grief makes everything worse or everything heightened. It makes the highs higher and the lows lower. So the conflict is interwoven, even if it feels separate at times.
And before we move on to someone else, Raquel, can you touch on his relationship with his abuelo? Because I'm also wondering too that he lost someone who was young, but then he's living with and caring for someone who's on the other side of life, right? And so how does that affect his grief process, but also his, you know, the sort of thoughts about his future, his own future?
Yeah, I've noticed a lot of times in a lot of YA books, if there's like a grandparent introduced who is beloved throughout the story, oftentimes I'm expecting that person is going to end up dying, just because it ends up being a very prominent theme, and it's understandable why that's explored. And so in a book that is about so many people dying too young and before it was their time, I wanted there to be this beloved grandfather who makes it to the end of the novel, but everyone is so heavily aware of the fact that he is getting older, and Santiago especially, and that stresses him out immensely. He struggles with OCD, and so he feels both a personal responsibility for taking care of his grandfather, but also this mental illness struggle with feeling like anything that he does or says is going to be directly responsible for someone's death. And so he finds a way to not quite make peace with death, but understand it as being a part of life as well, and recognizing that there is a big difference between someone dying when they are young and they have all this life ahead of them that they were meant to live, and somebody who has lived a really beautiful, wonderful life and is sort of content with slowing down and letting the end of their life sort of unfurl ahead of them. I think that is a difficult thing for him to grasp, but his abuelo sort of holds his hand and is like, you can't prevent this from happening. Like this is going to happen for the rest of your life. You are going to lose people, but this in particular is okay. I've made sort of my peace with the fact that my life is coming to an end and I'm happy with what I've lived. And you cannot spend your life so worried that everyone you love is going to die, because it's just a reality. It's a part of life that we all have to get used to. So I liked making that sort of juxtaposition between losing someone very young and losing someone preemptively in a way, who has lived a very happy and fulfilled life.
Yes, I'm very grateful you didn't kill off Abuelo. Juan, if you could talk a little bit about the other things going on in Marcos's life, the other characters he has to interact with, and in addition to, again, does his grief show through with everything, or is he able to sort of compartmentalize and experience other things?
Yeah, just sidebar. I love that I'm learning more about my own novel from hearing you all talk about yours. But I love the way you set up the question, Cindy, in terms of, this idea of this not being the only thing you're dealing with at the moment, right? When we have loss, we still have to tend to other responsibilities, whether it's a parent or a student, and these kinds of things. And for Marcos, his father was a protector. He was the man of the house, and everybody looked at him to sort of be that man of the house that was a protector and that was able to kind of keep things running in his own way. And so Marcos, as an older brother, to a younger sister, feels the burden of that responsibility. And so he is going to be a junior in high school, and his sister Daniela is going to be a freshman. And so that means they're going to be going to the same school. And that means Marcos knows exactly how the boys are that are in that school, that are in high school. And so he feels a huge responsibility through this process to also step up and be an older brother. He's tried to shield his mom from some of that pain, but she's busy trying to shield him from the pain. And so the only thing he can think to do is be a good older brother, even if it's not his biggest responsibility. It's something that he hangs on to and is cognizant of, right? And so he's sort of trying to wrestle with all of these things at the same time. And so I think that's one of the biggest things that he's dealing with at the moment. And so, yeah, I really like this question.
Well, and I think if he let the grief take over everything, then it would prevent him from being a good older brother. So I think sometimes having those other things to worry about can sort of bring you out of that grief, even if it's temporarily, right? So
yeah,
his sister is important to him, so he has to he can't be in grief mode 24/7 and be a good brother. So it's it kind of pulls us in and out of grieving, right? But yeah, I've read all your books and I love them all. So Ashley, let's go on to you.
So as I mentioned, Cruzita has the whole bakery thing that she didn't have before when Tío Chuy passed away. Like Theo Chui was the heart and soul of the bakery. That was his thing. That was his legacy. And kind of like Racquel said, like Cruzita was on her own trajectory, even at like 12 years old. Like she still has lofty dreams of just becoming famous. That's going to solve all of the financial burdens that, her family has because they live in a multi-generational house. So, her goals are really big already at 12 years old. So when Theo Chui passes, she now has to uphold his legacy and her legacy at the same time. And I think there was a mention of like how, and I think Racquel said it, when, death happens, like everything just feels larger and bigger. And so you have this 12-year-old thinking about a legacy at 12 years old, like what is her legacy going to be? And so she has to spend time thinking about that. So, but unfortunately, she wants to go enter this contest so that she could become a pop star and show everybody her talent. But her parents hold her back. Her family holds her back because they need help at the bakery. They need all hands on deck, basically, right? After Theo Chui passes, a lot of his employees, retire or go away, because they're starting to think about their own path in life. It's not always about the bakery, but now for this family, that becomes a thing. So Cruzita's being withheld from doing all that. And now she's learning other people's legacies, essentially. She's learning how to bake. She's learning how to make tortillas. All things she doesn't necessarily wanted to do, right? So I think that, she wants to do those things, but like as her mom says, she's not a very practical person. And her mom is trying to reel her into the reality that you can't just keep dreaming about these things. You have to do them, right? And I think for her, that's also a different kind of grief, right? When we think about like our dreams are kind of slowly fading or dying from our hands, like life is just not, I can just dream that I'm going to be on stage and then I'm there. Cruzita has to learn how to put in the hard work to uphold the bakery, uphold her own dreams and work towards something. So she has to be more practical in that sense. So I feel like in a lot of ways, and I didn't even think about this too deeply before, but she loses a little bit of her innocence or a little bit of her childhood goes away. She has to become an adult in some ways, right? She has to deal with customer service. She's baking. And I know she's only 12. But this also puts a burden on her friendships, her past friendships, because now her friends are in a, not only in a privileged area in the San Fernando Valley, but they're also privileged in life where they don't have to worry about these things. And so they're wondering, Kelly, Cruzita's best friend, is wondering why she has to do these things. It's not fair. Cruzita obviously agrees, but at the same time, Cruzita knows the reality, like she's in it. We can complain about it all we want, but we have to continue moving forward. So we start to also see the dissolve of Cruzita and Kelly's friendship over time. Because now you start seeing like the disconnect. Kelly is still dreaming and still in some ways having those lofty childhood kid dreams. And Cruzita's like, I can't, I'm sorry. And so there's a disintegration there. So Cruzita starts losing her best friend at the same time that she's known since like kindergarten. So I didn't even really think about like how all that deep that was. But like, again, like Juan said, and listening to all of us, I'm like, wow, yeah, there's a lot more threads in there. Like grief is always ever present, even when you're not thinking about it, even when you're living, there's still moments of grief and death somewhere. Wow.
Right. No, and I'm glad you brought up the relationship with her friends because I was going to ask you about that if you didn't, because that's another loss, right? So it's not like somebody's pet, like someone who's passed away, but she has this best friend and things change because of the death and her whole family structure, everything that's going on with her family, that when that friendship starts to fracture, you realize that she's dealing with another loss, and it's different. Obviously the person hasn't died, but we still feel the same emotions attached to grief when we lose a friendship, or you have a boyfriend, a girlfriend, you break up, like there's pain there, right? You lose something. I'm going to chime in a little bit about Lola Reyes because it fits with that. In my middle grade book that just came out, her father has passed away. And one of the things that my editor actually, and originally I had her having these two girlfriends that everything was great and they were going to be supportive of her. And she was like, no, that's a little too easy. Kind of bringing up this idea of like, grief can't just be the only thing that your character is dealing with. She's like, why don't we actually switch that up and have one girl, Ashlyn, who is her best friend, but when Lola comes home from Guatemala, she realizes she's hanging out with this new girl, Josie, and she's like, what just happened? Like, I was only away for a month, 6 weeks, and she comes home and her friendship has changed. And so similarly to Cruzita, like, you're not just dealing with that one thing. And now she's worried that in addition to having lost her father, she's about to lose her best friend, Ashlyn. And now she's really going to feel alone, and mama's back at work and she's in work. She's the type of person who's like, if I just keep moving and keep working, I won't break down. So everybody's dealing with grief in their own way and, in her family, but that secondary loss, that idea of like losing the friendship, in addition to having really lost somebody like in death. And actually, I think all of our books deal with that because Juan, in your book, he meets this new cool guy who's driving him around everywhere. And I don't want to give too much away, but there's a twist there where he suddenly realizes that like, this isn't going to probably be a long-term friendship. Like, I'm probably going to lose this friendship too. And can you talk a little bit about that? Like, does he see that as a loss? Do you think that's something that he's going to be grieving as well? Or is it something that he is able to come to terms with now that he's experienced the grief of the death of his father?
Yeah, and that's a great segue. I mean, when he meets this taxi driver, Camilo, they strike a friendship very fast, right? It's two young people. They both experienced loss before. And so it's really powerful the way young people can strike a relationship and become best friends immediately, where adults, we need time. But there's also a little bit of a betrayal that happens because Camilo is also hiding a secret. And so they think that they're building this trust, and they are, but that's another reason why the novel A Second Chance on Earth is sort of just another parallel, because it is a book about second chances in a lot of ways. And so when Marcos finds that Camilo has been hiding a secret from him for about a week, he has to wrestle with this idea of, is everyone worthy of forgiveness? Is everyone worthy of a second chance? And he ultimately decides that he is. But towards the end of the novel, obviously Marcos is not going to live in Cartagena for his whole life. They have to go back home to Miami. And so he is losing a friend in that process, but it becomes this friendship that was so impactful that it's going to probably reverberate in his life for many years to come, because they met each other at such an integral time in Marcos's life. So yeah, he is dealing with the passing of his father, but now, the end of a friendship, because it has to end at some point, so yeah.
And also, thank you. And also, Racquel, everybody, I mean, there's this huge group of friends, but as you mentioned with Santiago, he's left friends in California, and now he's going back to this group of friends. So maybe if you could talk a little bit about, not only has he lost Bryce, but what else is he potentially losing? And again, that kind of loss comes with its own feelings that are similar to grief, but I guess less painful in a way.
Yeah, he was very removed from the grief for several years, and that he was living in a completely different area where nobody knew Bryce. Santiago, Beatriz, and Bryce all grew up in a very small town in Vermont where everybody knew everybody knew everyone's life story and drama and family life and origin stories. And now he's living in LA where nobody knew, everyone just knew he was like the kid who moved from Vermont. And so he was able to kind of hide much easier and blend in. And he even says, like, it was easy to be myself. It was easy to be somebody else without like everyone in my life. And so when he returns, there's this grief in that he has lost a life where he got to pretend to be somebody else, where he got to pretend to be someone who didn't experience this. He, as unhealthy as it was, it sheltered him from actually facing and confronting the reality of the life that he now has to live. And once he is back there, it's not even the home that he used to know. He doesn't know how to be homesick for this place anymore, because that doesn't exist anymore. The Vermont, this small town that he was imagining for all these years, was one where Bryce was alive, where he was much younger, where he wasn't on the precipice of adulthood. And now that he's returned, there's a lot of grief, and that he's never going to be able to get back to that no matter what, he has lost that childhood, he has lost that innocence, and he has lost that place that he used to love. And for years he could at least pretend that it existed in some way, but now he's confronted with the direct reality that it's never going to be like his childhood was. And so that is something that he really has to grapple with throughout the novel, and it's hard for him to come to terms with the fact that what he did may have protected him in some way, but it also really hurt the people around him, that by ignoring everyone who was back in Vermont dealing with this loss, he prioritized his escapism over any type of reality or comfort or community. But also in California, the friendships that he made were sort of fraudulent, and that he never let those people truly get to know who he was and what he was experiencing. So he now has to make a decision about what kind of life he wants to actually pursue, and how he's going to make amends to all these people whose authenticity or connectivity he has deprioritized in pursuit of just escapism and pretending like none of this ever happened at all. So there's definitely a grief, both in that this loss existed, but also in realizing that like he is never going to have the life that he had before this loss.
Yeah, thank you. He was definitely an interesting sort of like living in the land of, I call it in my book, living in the land of denial. Like sort of like liking it there, right? because when you're living in that land, it's like you don't have to face the truth, the hard truths, and have to talk about everything. But that's exactly what happens to him once he comes back to Vermont. So I am going to go back now to the originally scheduled question. Each of your main characters, interestingly, turn to something creative to help them get through their grief. Or it's just sort of part of their story. With Cruzita, it's the music and learning how to play the violin and becoming a mariachi. And for Marcos, it's the literature. And for Beatriz, it's the makeup artistry, which I think originally when you start to read your book, it might seem like she's just becoming this sort of goth version of herself, just as a form of like rage or rebellion, But then you realize as you read along that like she really knows her stuff, and she's really like she's very artistic, and that's like a part of who she's become. So if you could each maybe talk a little bit how finding this creative outlet actually helps your main character with the grieving process. Ashley, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, so at the beginning of the novel, like Cruzita has her Theo Chui's handwriting on a piece of paper where he's translated an NSYNC song, "This I Promise You," which kids in her class tell her, that's already been translated in Spanish, you're cheating. But like, this is all she has and this is all she knows. And she not only like sort of chases like her Theo Chui's sort of ghost or in that grief, her Mama Vicenta bestows upon her this violin that has been hanging in their house for years. That was Mama Vicenta's and Theo Chui's dad's violin. And he used to be a mariachi. And so she is given that as Mama Vicenta's sort of token to say, hey, I see that you love music and you and your Theo Chui loved music together. This is my way of like creating a bond with you and also giving you a way out of this bakery so that you can continue on your pursuit of music. So here you go. But again, it's not what Cruzita had originally planned. She gets the violin. Maybe she thinks it's a mini guitar at the beginning. And she's like, yeah, cool. Grandma's going to take me to guitar school. I'm going to go like be a rock star. No, it's mariachi class. And so there's a different kind of grief there. And that Cruzita has to work through. And it's kind of like, it's not necessarily that she has like this loss of culture, but almost, right? Theo Chui is the symbolic representation of her culture. And without him there, she no longer has that guide. She has this violin. She has her new friend. She has Jaime, her teacher. And now she has to work through this process of like not knowing a language, but two languages, which is music. So you have Spanish language that she has to learn, and now she has to actually learn music beyond what she's learned in elementary school. So there is a kind of a grieving process. I don't know if anyone's ever taken like something totally new, and you're frustrated at first. Like, you have these blues and these woes that you're just not going to do well, right? I know I've experienced it as a singer myself. I'm like, I'm just never going to hit that note. So it's pointless. And there's this grief of like, this thing you want to chase is gone. So, but in learning all of this and pushing herself and forcing herself through these challenges, learning more about Spanish and more about mariachi, but also more about how Mexican musical artists have been ingrained into our culture for a long time. She learns more about Selena Quintanilla. She learns more about Richie Valens, who she didn't know as anyone but a person on a mural in her neighborhood, and that one song that her dad plays way too often. So she starts learning about these facets of herself that help her overcome this really big loss, because like I mentioned earlier, it brings her closer to the person that she lost. I don't want to give away too much, but there is this little moment at the end of the book where Theo Chuy does come back in some way to her, or at least she thinks he's there watching her become a mariachi. And for her, that solidifies her journey of, all of this heaviness. And at the end of all of it, music is her connection, is her tie back to her ancestry, and she's going to continue to follow that trajectory. That is her legacy.
That is still related to music, but not exactly how she had envisioned it. So she loses that original dream, but there's like the other path that she takes. Racquel, can you talk about Beatriz and her makeup artistry?
Yeah, incorporating makeup into the book as being this really relevant theme was very cool for me, because I took like official makeup classes when I was growing up. So this was like a passion of mine when I was a teenager. And this book was inspired by, or was an idea I started having when I was about 14 years old. So it was very influenced by my own teenage years. But yeah, Beatriz, when she was a child, was a very like happy-go-lucky kind of like tomboy-esque kid. And after Bryce's death, she shaves off all of her hair and she starts wearing entirely black, and she starts doing all this makeup. And it starts off as, being this thing that she kind of does to create this perpetual funeral effect in her life, and to also push people away, because in a small town where there isn't really an acceptance of like alternative fashion or alternative vibes, she is immediately sort of set as like the town loner and kind of a weirdo in some ways. And she likes that. She wants that effect. But at this point in the story, she's been doing this for several years, and she has learned the artistry behind it. For her, it's this very meticulous process. She pays attention to the different formulas that she uses, the different type of kind of blending techniques that she has. It's become this real way for her to express herself. And that's an interesting thing that gets woven throughout the story, that I'm very descriptive in her makeup, and she considers this like a really important thing. So she is highlighting the significance of it throughout the story. And you see at times when she starts to incorporate color into her makeup looks in some small ways. And when she reaches the end, she's kind of like realizing that this thing she created as a shield has actually become in some way who she is, that she and other people around her at some point gave up this idea that she was just going to wake up one day and walk downstairs and be who she was before and look the way she did before, because this is sort of who she is now. She has experienced this loss. She has experienced these years of her life and has changed as an effect of it. And something that started off being a negative in some way, and that she was trying to separate herself from people and trying to create this sort of harsh reality around her, has now become a thing that makes her feel good about herself and allows her to express herself, and something she wants to pursue, and something she even shares with other people. That her mom asks her to do her makeup at times, and she's meeting her father's mother and starting to connect with her, and gives her recommendations for different lipstick types. And people slowly begin to realize this isn't just something she's doing in her free time to get everyone to go away and look scary, that it's something she's actually genuinely really passionate about. And it gives her something she looks forward to in the future, that she wants to actually go to school and become certified in makeup and in this kind of artistry. So it's a really interesting thing that gets incorporated throughout the story, because it is something that starts off as a defense mechanism and then becomes something that gives her a lot of hope and interest. But it's also something that I really care about and like. So it's fun for me to get to incorporate it and actually use a lot of language, and kind of have to be pulled back at times by my editor with the amount of specificity I was getting into things, because I can get a little carried away with my own knowledge. But yeah, it was one of my favorite parts of the book.
I really liked that. I liked that it did evolve from being like that shield to being like this is something I could do with my life. Like, this is a real passion of mine. And I know, Juan, you've talked a little bit about his deep dive into 100 Years of Solitude, but is there anything else you want to add about how turning to literature has basically helped him with this grieving process?
Yeah, for Marcos, it's poetry, right? Like, that just becomes a lifeline. It was his father's love language, so much so that there would be times before bed where Papi's putting them to sleep, and Marcos's mother asks him to pray with the kids before they go to bed, and he says, yeah, I will. And instead he shares poems and he reads poetry to them. So it was like poetry disguised as prayer in a way. It was like their secret. And so it becomes this vehicle for Marcos's expression, his dreams, his hopes, his worries about the future. And ultimately, the book we're reading is the story that Marcos is writing. And so, for him, it was just falling in love with language and the power of language to sort of, diary, how it is that he's feeling and what he's dealing with.
Great, thank you. I know we're close to time, but there are a couple of great questions that have been submitted, so I'm hoping we can do a quick round, have everybody chime in. So one of the questions is, how do your characters find support in your stories? So who around them or what around them is providing them with support as they are going through their grieving process? Juan, since we ended with you, why don't we start with you this time?
Yeah, I think in sort of an indirect way, it's the poetry that he's reading. So for Marcos, it's not necessarily a person. It is the friendship he strikes with Camilo, in a certain way, maybe in more of a peripheral way as just human to human, but it's really, the poetry that he reads is kind of what's helping him, with the grieving process more than anything, because he's finding his father in these characters. He's finding his father in the language. And so it's sort of this way of having his father talk him through his own death. Wow, that's a cool idea. I never thought about that. Yeah, that's it.
You're learning about your own book.
It's like the more we talk about this, our own novels, we sit with them for so long.
You're seeing all the layers.
We see all of these,
already. Yeah.
And just listening to you all talk about your own novels, I'm like, oh my God, that's this is like a therapy session for all of us.
Exactly. Racquel, what kind of support do you have for your characters? Where do they find support?
Yeah, I think they both find support in the people around them by finally being honest about what they're feeling and willing to be vulnerable with the people around them. Willing to turn to Santiago, being willing to turn to his abuelo, but also being willing to turn to people who he kind of in some way abandoned over the past several years, and seeing what they truly need and what this loss has been like for them. And for Beatriz, kind of admitting to her mother that she has been struggling immensely and being willing to grapple with the guilt that she feels over just the fact of her existence, and saying, like, it's fine if I feel like somewhat of a burden. Like, part of love is being willing to carry things for each other, but also with each other. The Beatriz and Santiago struggling with knowing that the other person is hurting so immensely and not wanting to add anything, but them saying, like, this is something we can hold both together. Like, I don't want you to ever feel like your difficulty is a burden for me, because it lessens it for you. It's not putting anything on me. It's a way for us to share in this together. So they find support outside of their relationship with each other, but the forefront of the novel is really about them finding that connection together.
Great, thank you. And Ashley, if you can talk quickly about the support that she finds.
Yeah, definitely Cruzita finds support outside of the bakery and school and the mariachi classes that she's taking. New friends, new teachers, all of which who sort of see that she has all of this anger, but also potential to be a great musician if she just allows people in, right? Grief allows us to put up those walls, and in some ways, like, makes us more insecure sometimes. So all of the friends and people there really help her break down those walls and, become the musician she's meant to become.
I will add that in my middle grade novel, Lola finds support in a person that she never thought she would ever. She actually calls him her nemesis, her next door neighbor who she cannot stand. But there are worry dolls involved, and they come to life, and so there's this whole other thing happening. But because he's a believer in the mystical and supernatural, he's pretty much the only person who can help her without everyone else kind of thinking she's weird or lying. So I liked that aspect of being like, turning to somebody or something that you never thought you would actually like lean on that person. He's one of the only people she can actually trust in this moment, and she has to sort of change her idea of like who she becomes friends with and what friendship really means. And also to ask for help, because I think that's one thing that our characters like have to learn at some point is, when do you stop holding all of it in and ask for the help or ask for the support that you need? And at least I know in my novel, that's a huge moment, you know, for her to say like, we need to talk, like we need to talk this out. We need to, I need help with this. And that's not always an easy thing to do. All right, so we were almost at the 5-minute mark. Does anybody want to make sure that you can do a last minute plug for your book, make sure everybody sees the cover, talk about where we can find you on social media, anything else that you want to mention? Juan, why don't we start with you?
Yes. Hello again, everyone, and so grateful that you all tuned in. My socials are, this is complicated. It's Juan Love, like one love, but my name Juan. It's Juan Love. And yes, thank you all for tuning in. This has been a lot of fun getting to know everyone and hearing about everybody's books. So it's been
And Juan, where are you on social media mostly? Are you on Instagram, or is there
Instagram? I don't tweet as much these days, as probably a lot of us don't. But yeah,
Right.
it's the same. It's Juan Love
on Instagram?
and Twitter. Yeah.
Okay, good. Ashley, how about you?
Yeah, so one more time, Cruzita and the Mariacheros, this is me. You can find me on Instagram and or Threads at Miss Ashley Jean Writes. And yeah, there will be another book in 2026 that was just announced, another middle grade, tentatively titled Choir Girl. So we're going to stick with the music theme. So I'm really excited for that one. It's an emo-based book. So for all of you emo fans out there, please wear your My Chem shirts. Yeah.
Awesome. And Racquel, where can people find you online, and what are you working on now?
So yeah, one more time, This Is Me Trying is my third book. I have my other 2 books, Ophelia After All and You Don't Have a Shot behind me. And I have another book coming out in June of next year called If We Survive This, that is a zombie apocalypse book. So it's a bit tonally different, but it deals very heavily with themes of grief as well, sort of zombie apocalypse as a metaphor for grief. So very excited for that. And to find me on socials, I'm mainly on Instagram and TikTok, but they're 2 different handles. On Instagram, I'm blonde_with_a_book. And on TikTok, it's Racquel_Marie_. So underscores are kind of the backbone of my usernames, but those are 2 good places to find me.
Awesome. And I am Cindy L. Rodriguez. My book that just came out a week ago was Lola Reyes Is So Not Worried. Currently working on revisions for a book that will be out in 2026. It is called The Fire Serpent Legacy, which is actually mostly based, takes place in Brazil, deals with the Amazon rainforest and the mythical fire serpent that protects the rainforest, and a girl who finds an egg and realizes she's connected to that legacy. So that is forthcoming. Thank you all so very much for attending the Wish You Were Here panel at the Latinx Kidlit Book Festival. We hope that you subscribe to the channel and enjoy all of the other wonderful panels that are coming your way during the celebration. Thank you so much.
Thank you.